Good afternoon and welcome to the Midday News. Here's what we have in the bulletin. Health Minister responds to Auditor General questions on COVID-19 spend. Private sector reacts to $60 billion supplementary estimates. And later in sports, former ISSA competition officer George Forbes is dead. Thank you for joining us. I'm Shamela Pullen. Here are the details. The Auditor General has found several flaws in how funds allocated to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic were spent by the Ministries of Health and Wellness and Labor and Social Security Ministry. The Auditor General's report on the findings was tabled in the House of Representatives yesterday. O'Shane Masters reports.
The government allotted just over $8 billion to the Ministry of Health and Wellness, and the Ministry of Labor and Social Security got $1.1 billion. The report showed that the Ministry of Health and Wellness made payments totaling $337 million to 7 hotels and guest houses to provide quarantine accommodations, but only one of the service providers was contracted formally. The ministry also paid out $124 million to 8 suppliers for infrastructural works without any contract being in place. The Ministry of Health was also cited for failing to abide by the Financial Administration and Audit Act in the transfer of $174 million to several agencies, with concerns raised about the mechanisms put in place to monitor and track the COVID-19 emergency spending. The Health Ministry spent $189.21 million for the purchase of fixed assets, which were reportedly acquired to support its COVID-19 response efforts. The Auditor General found that the sum included $23 million worth of assets not included in its inventory and $2 million spent on television sets and tablets for which there was no indication on how they related to the ministry's COVID-19 response initiatives. The review found that the Ministry of Labor and Social Security's database provided no assurance that only eligible persons got humanitarian assistance, nor were there records to ensure proper accountability and transparency in the receipt and distribution of items. O'Shane Masters, Radio Jamaica.
Meanwhile, the Health Minister says a fulsome response will be provided at Parliament's Public Accounts Committee PAC to irregularities identified by the Auditor General in how funds allocated to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic were spent by the ministry. The Auditor General's report on the findings was tabled in the House of Representatives yesterday. Dr. Tufton says the Permanent Secretary in his ministry, Dunstan Bryan, will be addressing the concerns.
The Chief Operating Officer, who is the Permanent Secretary for the Ministry, who presides over these issues, would be required to give his response, and I think that's the appropriate place to do it. And so I would await and encourage you and others to await the date at the PAC when those responses would be forthcoming. So I'm going to ask you for some patience, and the country for some patience on the issue until then, which hopefully will be soon.
For the opposition spokesman on health, the details of the report are concerning.
There's always in the national contract program, or the public procurement as it is called now, facilities for emergency procurement, which I note from the AG's report that some have been entered into, but the ministry has not given justification for those. So even if they had entered into an emergency procurement with those hotels, there ought to have been a contract. And the ministry has exposed itself to a lot of potential payments which they might not be liable for. For example, as quoted, they had to pay the light bill as well as 90% of the water rate. Now, how can you reconcile that?
And there are mixed reactions to the announcement by Finance Minister Dr. Nigel Clark regarding an additional $60 billion to the budget. In announcing the supplementary estimates in Parliament yesterday, Dr. Clark pointed to issues like the rise in inflation, the need for more money for public sector wages and social programs among the factors for the revised budget. But President of the Jamaica Manufacturers and Exporters Association, John Mahfood, says some items that were announced in the supplementary estimate estimates should not have been. He says those should have been covered by the $912 billion budget, which was approved for this fiscal year.
They have to find $21 billion for the public sector workers indicates to me that in their planning last year and their discussion about public sector reform, this should have been in the budget. It shouldn't have come as a surprise in a supplementary budget.
However, financial analyst Dennis Strong does not agree.
We have to be reasonable. I mean, you know, if you have inflation at 10%, right, then how do you negotiate around that? And I don't agree with the comment that the increase in interest rates was not necessary. If you'd never have that, then you'd have had a wider disparity between Jamaican and U.S. interest rates. And that would have led to depreciation of the currency. That would have been much worse for us. So instead of looking at a 10%, maybe we might have been looking at a 15% effectively, or a 20% inflation.
Both men were speaking on the morning agenda on Power 106 FM. The public defender is sending a stern warning to justices of the peace about collecting monies to carry out their duties. Caroline Reed Cameron says if a JP is found guilty, there will be serious consequences. Over the years, the roles and responsibilities of justices of the peace have grown. As such, public defender Caroline Reed Cameron says JPs need to understand and know their functions clearly.
You all by now should know that it is voluntary. You all should know by now that there is no remuneration that is attendant upon the services that you render to the citizens of this country. That has actually been codified in legislation, the Justices of the Peace Act of 2018.
And so by now, justices of the peace must know it is illegal to collect monies from persons in exchange for carrying out their duties.
Never let it be said that a complaint has been logged in my register complaining that any of you have collected money in the name of being a justice of the peace. I will launch an investigation and the consequences may be dire.
But she says her office is willing to work with the JPs to overcome the challenges.
Step out together to satisfy the needs of the citizens of this country for transparency and good governance, satisfy the needs of the citizens of this country that they can feel that they are getting justice and that there will be peace.
The public defender was addressing justices of the peace at a function in St. Anne recently. Meanwhile, public defender Caroline Reed Cameron says some members of the public are confused about the use of her office.
You would have persons coming in, writing in, calling in to the office. Usually women, to complain that their husbands, their sons, their baby fathers, any other description you choose to put on top of it, but their men are locked up and they want the public defender to intervene, to defend them because they are innocent. That is not necessarily what we do.
The Education Ministry plans to conduct a survey in the recently launched End Violence in Schools campaign. Acting Director for Safety and Security in Schools, Richard Troop, was addressing a march against crime and violence in Jamaica on Sunday.
We want to know how our students and educators and adults in our school feel about their safety at school and as they journey to school. Our intention is to strengthen the psychosocial intervention programs in all public schools. We want to partner with the Safety and Security branch of the Jamaica Constabulary Force and CTOC to support our efforts in launching our Anti-Gang Week campaign in schools. under the theme Lego the Gang, Lift Up Jamaica.
Meanwhile, with the police commissioner last week revealing that 875 children 5 to 17 years old have been charged with major crimes over the past 4 years, he questioned whether these children were actively enrolled in schools at the time, and if they were, did some adults fail them, causing them to turn to crime.
How many of these children were excluded from their schools because they were suspended or expelled? How many of these 875 students were excluded because their parents or guardians have failed to ensure they are enrolled and engaged in school? We see them in the community when they should be in school, but because they are not our children, we choose not to care, not to act in their best interests.
For the latest in the economy, here's Cody and Barrett with the Business Minute.
In the world of business, Finance Minister Dr. Nigel Clark responded to concerns raised by opposition spokesman on commerce Anthony Hilton regarding increases in the time for processing shipments coming into the country's container ports. Dr. Clark says the government will have to look at strategies to improve efficiency at the ports.
But one compromise that we cannot make is on the security side, right? That some people have wanted us, right, in that the security procedures have to be followed and maintained, and we have to support the Customs Administration as far as that is concerned. But we will, at the same time, need to introduce measures that can alleviate some of the congestion.
In business overseas, Facebook parent Meta is laying off 11,000 employees as it makes an uncertain and costly bet on pivoting to the metaverse. There have been numerous job cuts at other tech companies that hired rapidly during the pandemic. Meta did see a boom during the pandemic, but more competition lately from rivals like TikTok is hurting the company's bottom line. Meta's shares have dropped more than 70% this year alone. Other tech companies like Lyft and Amazon are also cutting or freezing jobs. That's it for the Business Minute. I'm Cody Ann Barrett.
And here's a preview of what's coming up in this evening's health report. In this evening's health report, we look at diabetic foot ulcers.
The other thing too that we need to remember is in the diabetic individual, there is poor circulation. Therefore, there is irritable, nervous endings down in the feet. And these irritable nerve endings present themselves as numbness, pins and needles sticking, they'll tell you little cramps, the foot drawing up and so on. And one of the first impulses a lot of our patients have is to go and soak the foot in warm water, or to beat the foot, or to massage the leg, or some such thing that attempts to interfere with the tissues.
That's a health report in Primetime News at 7. And now for today's healthy living tip. Examine your feet daily for calluses, blisters, or open wounds. Wash your feet daily with warm soap and water. Do not walk barefoot or wear shoes without socks. It's now time for the top regional and international stories with O'Shane Masters.
In the region, the Ghana Parliament has approved an amendment to the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Control Amendment Bill of 2021. The passage of this bill paves the way for the removal of custodial sentences for persons in possession of 30 grams or less of ganja. Now, Ghana's Minister of Legal Affairs, who piloted the bill, says the government was forced to balance competing interests and rights when crafting the amendments to the existing narcotics law. On the international scene, the threat of a direct strike from a Category 1 hurricane triggered mandatory evacuations in Florida on Wednesday. The rare November storm is bringing life to a grinding halt in the Sunshine State as people along its east coast brace for impact. Several school districts are now closed, and the Orlando International Airport is ceasing all commercial operations beginning at 4 p.m. on Wednesday. This comes just 6 weeks after Hurricane Ian's deadly wrath, so people are having a hard time coping with the new threat of this tropical storm. And those were the top regional and international stories. I'm O'Shane Masters.
We head to a quick break. When we come back, we'll have your midday sports report with Renata Brown.